Manuel Hernandez was 47 years old, and he had spent more than 20 of those years behind the wheel of his old white Freightliner truck, which he called La Esperanza. He had traveled along Federal Highway 57 so many times that he no longer needed a GPS or maps. Every curve, every gas station, every taco stand was like a mark on his own skin. He lived alone in a modest apartment in Querétaro, with a framed photo of his deceased brother in the living room and a rosary hanging from the rear view mirror. His routine remained unchanged, carrying tools, driving, delivering. It was an existence without surprises, without company, with no clear destination. He had no wife, children, or pets, just his truck, the radio, and the memories that refused to disappear. That hot, cloudless May morning, he started the engine as usual, never imagining that something as simple as stopping on a curve would lead him to an unforgettable experience. As he continued towards San Luis Potosí, the engine purring, and the sun beating down on the windshield, something caught his attention as he passed through the small town of El Huizache. On the side of the road, under a relentless sun, a group of men walked in a single file. They were dressed in dusty robes, as if from another era. Manuel slowed down instinctively, without knowing why. One of them moved forward. He had long hair, a thick beard, and a look so serene it made Manuel shudder. He signaled with his hand. He said nothing. He just waited. Against all logic, Manuel stopped. He rolled down the window and asked, "Where are you going?" The man looked at him with profound calm and replied, "Wherever you're going, if you're willing to take us." Manuel hesitated for a few seconds, his hands still on the wheel. He'd heard all kinds of stories on the road, robberies, tricks, ambushes, but something about that man gave him a peace that was hard to explain. Without asking for more details, he nodded and opened the passenger door. Jesús, that's what he gave his name, got in silently, followed by the other 12, who settled into the back of the trailer among tool boxes and sacks of materials. They didn't complain about the heat or the dust. They didn't ask for water or food. They just settled in with a disconcerting serenity. As they resumed their journey, Manuel couldn't stop glancing at the man in the light-colored robes. He didn't say much, but his presence filled the cabin as if music were playing, as if the engine, noise were fading momentarily. And although they didn't exchange many words, Manuel felt something inside him beginning to move, like an old cog that had been rusting for years. For the first few kilometers, Manuel tried to resume his routine, turning on the radio, commenting on the weather, cracking a joke about the potholes. Jesús responded with brief smiles, but it was clear he wasn't there to make small talk. Every so often he glanced out the window, as if remembering something the others weren't seeing. At a gas stop, one of the companions, a bright-eyed young man who called himself Andrés, helped the gas station attendant lift a heavy box without being asked. The man, surprised, smiled his thanks. Nothing spectacular, nothing out of the ordinary, but Manuel felt it. Something stirred in the air. It was as if these men carried with them an ancient, contagious calm. And although he didn't understand why, he was grateful not to be alone that day. As the journey progressed, Manuel began to notice details that normally went unnoticed. The sky seemed clearer, the heat less oppressive. In each town they passed, something small but significant was happening. At a dusty intersection, they saw an older woman sitting under an awning with an empty cooler. Without anyone saying a word, one of the men, Santiago, with a thick beard and intense gaze, got out and offered her a bottle of water. She smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude, as if this gesture was the first in a long time. Manuel watched from his seat without intervening. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he felt that each of these encounters left a mark, not only on the others, but on himself. For the first time in years, he wanted more than to reach his destination. He wanted to keep traveling. If this part made you feel something, subscribe to the channel. I want to keep telling stories like this with you. At a roadside diner, they paused for a meal. The place was almost empty, save for a small boy playing with a deflated ball, while his mother, wearing a stained apron, waited on the tables. Jesus approached the boy, bent down wordlessly, and handed him a new ball that had appeared from nowhere. The mother, seeing the scene, shed a tear. Manuel saw her put her hand to her chest, surprised and moved. No one took photos. No one asked for anything in return. The group ate in silence, with a calm that seemed to infect even the birds fluttering among the trees. As they returned to the truck, Manuel felt something in his chest loosen, as if an old tension were beginning to unravel. And for the first time in a long time, he smiled without realizing it. The next part of the journey took them through a more desert-like area, where the heat seemed to melt the asphalt. Manuel slowed down when he saw a group of migrants in the distance resting in the shade of a rusty pole. They were 4 adults and 2 children, with worn backpacks and exhausted looks. Without asking, Jesus asked him to stop. One by one, the men got out of the trailer and began distributing the little they had: bread, water, fruit. Jesus approached a boy whose lips were chapped by the sun, and with a simple gesture, he wiped his face with a handkerchief. There were no speeches, no solemn phrases, just silence and presence. Manuel stayed in the cab, watching, with a lump in his throat. He felt ashamed of all the times he'd driven past, of all the times he'd refused to look. That night, they slept near Matehuala, at a small truck stop. Manuel usually slept inside his cab, with the door closed and the radio on, as if the noise would protect him from the silence. But this time, the men formed a small circle on the ground and sat around a makeshift campfire. They invited him to join. He hesitated but finally came down. Jesus didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were like stones in water. They caused ripples that spread through one. He spoke of forgiveness, not as a religious thing, but as an intimate act. He said that sometimes forgiveness doesn't need to be spoken, but felt, that one can free oneself without the other knowing. Manuel didn't respond, but that night he dreamed of his brother. He saw him smiling, wearing the same shirt he'd been wearing the day of the accident. When he woke up, he couldn't tell if it had been a dream or something more. The next morning, the group hit the road early, before the sun began to beat down. Manuel wasn't a man to talk about himself, but that day, without understanding why, he began to tell his story. He talked about his childhood in Leon, about how his mother raised him alone after his father's death, about his younger brother, Luis, who had died in a motorcycle accident 15 years earlier. Jesus didn't interrupt him. He just looked at him attentively, with that gaze that doesn't judge or evaluate, only embraces. Manuel realized he hadn't spoken this much to anyone in years. The words came out naturally, as if he'd been waiting all this time for someone to really listen. When he finished, Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder, saying nothing. And it was that gesture, so simple, that made Manuel burst into tears. Sometimes we just need someone to really listen. If you're here, subscribing is a way of saying, I'm here too. Hours later, while crossing a winding, foggy, mountainous area, something happened Manuel would never forget. A car was coming in the opposite direction, traveling too fast, and as he tried to avoid it, another vehicle lost control and went off the road. Manuel instinctively stopped. The car had fallen into a small ditch, and inside, a woman was screaming desperately with her unconscious son in her arms. As the others ran to help, Jesus approached slowly. He touched the boy's forehead, closed his eyes, and murmured something barely audible. A few seconds later, the boy opened his eyes and began to cry. The mother fell to her knees, trembling. Manuel, standing at the side of the road, felt goosebumps rise on his skin. He didn't understand what he had witnessed, but deep down, he knew it was no coincidence. He could no longer deny that something extraordinary was happening. After the incident, the atmosphere in the truck changed. They didn't talk about the miracle as if it was something that didn't need explaining, but everyone had felt it. Even the men in the back, who barely knew Manuel, now looked at him more closely. They shared bread, short stories, and silences. Jesus, didn't proclaim anything. He didn't talk about faith or religion, but everything about him seemed to speak of something else, of something greater. Manuel began to notice how his thoughts were becoming clearer. He remembered things he had forgotten, like the song his mother used to sing to put him to sleep, or the soccer games he played with his brother in a vacant lot near his house. It was as if every kilometer was releasing a weight he had unwittingly carried. The road was no longer just a path. It was a kind of moving confessional. That afternoon, they made a stop in a town that seemed frozen in time. The streets were dirt, the houses were adobe, and the air smelled of firewood. A small white church stood at the end of the main street. Jesus stopped in front of it and stared silently. Manuel watched him from the truck, curious. After a few minutes, Jesus went in alone, while the others waited outside. No one said anything. When he came back out, he was carrying a small wooden cross in his hand. He didn't buy it or take it without permission. He simply appeared with it. He handed it to Manuel without a word. He received it carefully, as if it was something fragile, sacred. He placed it on the dashboard of the truck, next to the rosary hanging from the rear-view mirror. And for the first time since he had known him, he dared to ask him, "Who are you really?" Jesus simply replied, "A wayfarer, like you." That night, they slept outdoors. Jesus had suggested stopping at a high point where the lights of distant villages flickered like stars above the land. They lit a small fire, and Manuel, without knowing why, brought an old blanket he always kept in the cabin. They sat in a circle, and one of the men, Tomas, began to play a harmonica with soft, almost childlike melodies. Jesus remained silent, his gaze fixed on the fire. Manuel watched him out of the corner of his eye, trying to understand how someone could convey so much without saying anything. At one point, one of the men asked if they could talk about their fears. No one mocked, no one interrupted. One by one, they shared their pain, guilt, and wounds. When Manuel's turn came, he remained silent for a long time, until he said, "I'm afraid of not being forgiven for everything I failed to do." Jesus looked at him and responded with a chilling calm. "Forgiveness isn't earned, it's received. You just have to open your heart." The next day, the road looked different. It wasn't that the landscape had changed, but Manuel's eyes saw it differently. He noticed the flowers along the sides of the road, the colors of the sunrise, the sounds of the birds that had previously eluded him. Jesus, sitting in the passenger seat, didn't say much, but his presence seemed to amplify everything around them. As they passed through a checkpoint, they were stopped for a search. A young officer, visibly tense, asked for the vehicle's papers. Manuel calmly obeyed. Jesus rolled down his side window and greeted the officer with a serene smile. The officer stared at him for a few seconds. Then, as if something had softened him inside, he returned the documents without asking questions. "Have a good trip," he said before driving away. Manuel started the engine with a new feeling in his chest, a peace that no longer depended on the road, but on what he carried inside. Somewhere between San Felipe and Saltillo, they stopped by a dry stream bed. Jesus got out first, walking a few meters toward the empty riverbed. He bent down and began tracing lines in the earth with his fingers. The others watched him in silence. Manuel got out too, curious. When he got closer, he saw that Jesus had drawn a circle with a cross in the center. "Water once flowed here," he said, "and it will flow again when someone needs it." It didn't sound like a prophecy, but like a certainty. Manuel couldn't understand whether he meant it literally or figuratively, but that phrase stuck with him. Later, at that same spot, they saw a family arrive with a broken-down car. They weren't asking for help, they were just trying to rest. One of the men in Jesus's group offered to check the engine, another handed out fruit, and Jesus simply sat with the father, listening. Sometimes that was enough to be heard. During the journey north, they passed through villages where time seemed to have stopped. In one of them, a woman ran up to the truck. She was holding a feverish baby. Desperate, she called for help. Manuel didn't know what to do. There were no clinics nearby and cell phone service was non-existent. Jesus got out, carefully picked up the baby and cradled him silently. He closed his eyes, held him for a few minutes, and then returned him to his mother. The child was still feverish, but breathing more calmly. The woman, with tears in her eyes, kissed Jesus's hands. He said nothing. He just handed her a small piece of cloth, like a handkerchief, and returned to the truck. Manuel observed everything with a mixture of wonder and humility. He no longer sought explanations. He was beginning to accept that some encounters were not meant to be understood, but experienced, and that perhaps that was the true miracle. As they approached the city of Saltillo, Manuel began to remember his father. He hadn't thought about him clearly in years. He remembered his voice, his way of driving, how he used to take him to see Santos Laguna games in a dusty stadium. His father had died of a heart attack when Manuel was 18. They never got to say a proper goodbye. There was always that last argument, that slammed door that still weighed on his soul. Jesus, without him saying anything, commented gently, "Sometimes you don't need a last word to heal a wound. You just need to reconcile yourself with the memory." Manuel looked at him, surprised. "How do you know that?" he asked. Jesus smiled and replied, "I don't know. I just felt it." It was then that Manuel began to suspect that this man was no simple traveler, but instead of being frightened, he felt a deep gratitude, as if finally someone was helping him untie the knots he'd been carrying for years. At a gas station on the outskirts of Ramos Arizpe, a group of young men were cleaning windshields to earn a few coins. One of them approached the truck and asked permission to clean the glass. Manuel, who previously would have said no without thinking, rolled down his window and nodded. While the boy was working, Jesus asked his name. "Daniel," he replied suspiciously. Jesus smiled at him and said, "Daniel means God is my judge. Never forget that." The boy paused for a moment, confused, then timidly nodded his thanks. Before leaving, one of the men in Jesus's group gave him a small bag of food. Daniel received it silently, but his eyes shone. Manuel started the engine again, certain that somehow that day had changed for that young man too, and deep inside something told him the trip still had much to teach him. They spent the night in a large field next to an abandoned train station. The place was filled with dry grass and rusted structures left behind by time. Manuel sat on an old wooden bench while the others prepared a simple dinner, tortillas, beans, and a little cheese. Jesus didn't eat much. He seemed more interested in the conversations than in the food. That night, he spoke of hope, not as a future promise, but as a daily decision. "Hoping isn't staying still," he said. "It's continuing to walk with faith, even when you can't see the whole path." Manuel listened intently, as if each word unlocked something he'd long hidden. He thought of all the times he'd felt lost, and how habit had convinced him that this was just how life was. But that night, as the wind blew across the abandoned rails, he felt something inside him begin to rebuild. The next day, they resumed their journey toward Monterrey. It was the last leg of their trip, and although no one had said it out loud, everyone knew it. The atmosphere in the truck was different, more serene, more profound, as if everyone knew something was about to end or perhaps begin. Jesus looked out the window in silence, as if bidding farewell to the landscape. At one point along the way, they stopped at a bridge that crossed a clear stream. Jesus got out alone, bent down, touched the water with his fingers, and crossed himself. Manuel, from the cab, felt a chill. It wasn't fear, it was respect. When Jesus returned to the truck, he handed him a small, smooth, damp, heart-shaped stone. "Keep it," he said. "When you doubt yourself, remember that you have been loved." Manuel put it in his shirt pocket without saying a word, but he knew he would never lose it. As they entered the outskirts of Monterrey, the traffic thickened, and the sounds of the city began to fill the air. Horns, street vendors, gigantic billboards. Everything contrasted with the calm they had experienced in recent days. Manuel felt as if the world had continued, to turn while they inhabited another time. Jesus didn't seem disturbed by the urban chaos. On the contrary, he observed everything with a mixture of tenderness and sadness. As they reached a traffic light, a man with a crutch was begging for coins between cars. Manuel rolled down the window and gave him his spare change. It wasn't much, but for the first time, he didn't feel he was giving out of obligation. Jesus said softly, "It's not how much you give, it's how you give." Manuel nodded. Silently, he understood that this trip hadn't taught him great new truths, but rather had reminded him of the essentials, and that was even more powerful. When they finally parked in a rest area near the center, the group got out leisurely. Each one gathered their few belongings and began to say goodbye. There were no tears, no dramatic hugs, just long, sincere glances, as if they understood each other beyond words. Jesus was the last to get out. He stopped in front of Manuel, who hadn't yet left the booth. "Thank you for stopping that day," he said in a calm voice. "Not everyone dares to stop." Manuel got out, feeling his legs tremble. He wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Jesus handed him a small wooden cross, very similar to the previous one, but this one had an inscription: "Where there is a willing heart, there I will be." Then, without further ado, he turned and walked down the street, followed by his 12 companions. Manuel watched him disappear into the crowd, with the clear feeling that something sacred had just passed through his life. Manuel stood next to the truck, holding the cross, his eyes fixed on the empty street. The noise of the city continued, but he didn't hear it the same way anymore. It felt as if the world had slowed down just for him. He climbed back into La Esperanza and looked at the still warm passenger seat. An invisible imprint remained there, a presence that seemed reluctant to leave completely. He started the engine, slowly. On the dashboard next to the rosary were the heart-shaped stone and the first cross Jesus had given him. Impulsively, he took both and put them in the glove compartment, like someone guarding something they don't want anyone else to touch. He didn't know what he would do now, whether he would continue on the same route or change course. But one thing was clear. He was no longer the same man who had left Querétaro that morning. In the following days, Manuel returned to his work, but everything felt different. Every stop, every customer, every conversation seemed to carry a new weight. At a hardware store in Matehuala, he helped a young porter lift a package without being asked. At a taco stand, he sat with an elderly man alone, sharing his food. He didn't do it to look good or out of habit, it simply came from his soul. He felt that Jesus was still with him, not in the flesh, but in the form of a decision, a gaze, an impulse to do the right thing. Some nights, he dreamed of the group. They walked through deserts, crossed villages, sat under starry skies. In his dreams, Manuel wasn't driving, he walked with them. And when he woke up, he didn't feel sadness, but purpose. Something inside him drove him to continue sharing what he had received, without grand words, without expectations, only with presence. A couple of weeks later, while driving toward Torreon, he came across a scene that paralyzed him. On the side of the road, a pickup truck had crashed into a utility pole, and a woman was crying desperately with a small child in her arms. No one else was stopping. Manuel braked sharply, got out of the truck, and ran toward them. The child was unconscious. For a second, he felt the same fear he had that time with Jesus. He didn't know what to do, but he did know he couldn't remain motionless. He remembered what Jesus had done, being present. He knelt beside the woman, placed his hand on the child's forehead, closed his eyes, and without words, asked for her to come back. It wasn't a formal prayer, nor a learned prayer, just a pure, desperate, and loving wish. The child coughed. He opened his eyes slowly. The mother hugged him as if he were about to fall apart. Manuel remained silent, not understanding, but deeply grateful. After that day, Manuel began to jot down in a notebook every gesture he witnessed, every glance, every act of kindness he encountered along the way. They weren't flashy miracles. They were people helping push a car, sharing a bottle of water, listening without judgment. He began collecting those stories like someone guarding treasures. At one point, he thought about telling them in a book, but something inside him told him it wasn't necessary. It was enough to experience them and share them with whoever was willing to listen. One night, at a roadside cafe, a young truck driver asked him about the cross hanging on his rearview mirror. Manuel simply replied, "A man who taught me to look differently gave it to me." The young man didn't fully understand, but he kept thinking, and that, for Manuel, was enough, because now he knew that seeds are planted not with words, but with actions. As the months passed, Manuel became a different person in the eyes of those who knew him. His colleagues noticed that he no longer argued about delays, that he yielded without complaint, that he smiled more. At a truckers' meeting in San Luis Potosi, one of them, Raul, an old acquaintance of his, confronted him, laughing. "And what happened to you, brother? You used to be one of those who grumbled about everything." Manuel simply replied, "One day I stopped on the road, and I found something I didn't know I was missing." Raul didn't insist, but from then on he began to look at him with a different kind of respect, because Manuel hadn't become a preacher or a mystic. He was still a trucker with his worn boots and bitter coffee. But something in him had softened. It was as if every gesture was guided by a different compass, one that pointed inward. On a delivery near Piedras Negras, he met a woman named Clara who worked as a warehouse manager. She had a tired but honest look on her face. While they signed the shipping papers, they exchanged a few words and ended up sharing a coffee in a corner of the warehouse. Clara told him about her teenage daughter, a recent divorce, and how difficult it was to maintain balance. Manuel listened attentively, without interrupting. In the end, she said, "Thank you for not trying to fix me. I just needed to talk." Manuel smiled. She hadn't given advice, she hadn't summoned anyone, she had just been there, present. And he understood that, just as Jesus had done for him, sometimes the greatest gift one can offer is simply to stay, without judgment, without haste, just to accompany. And in that simple gesture, he revealed that the divine doesn't always descend from heaven. Sometimes it arrives in the form of shared silence. Do you feel this story is for you too? Then, subscribe. Let's continue this journey together. One afternoon, while driving through a rural area near Linares, he saw a solitary figure walking along the side of the road in the distance. It wasn't Jesus, but for a second, his heart raced. It was a young man with a backpack over his shoulder and torn shoes. Manuel stopped the truck without thinking twice. He offered him a ride a few kilometers. The boy, surprised, accepted. During the journey, he spoke little. He said he was looking for work, that he had left his town without really knowing where life would take him. Manuel offered him water and bread and listened attentively. As he got out, the young man thanked him and added, "Not everyone stops." Manuel smiled at him, and as the boy drove away, he shouted from the window, "Where there's a willing heart, I'll be there." He didn't know why he repeated that phrase, but as he said it, he felt something inside him fall back into place. That night, parked at a high point overlooking the valley, Manuel took the cross out of the glove compartment and held it in his hands. The wind stirred the cabin curtains, and the sky was clear, full of stars. He thought about everything that had changed, not in his job, not in his roots, but in his way of inhabiting the world. He no longer sought miracles, he recognized them, in every face, in every story, in every small act that he would have previously overlooked. And he understood that Jesus hadn't come to impress nor to demonstrate power. He had come to remember, to ignite what was already within him. That night, for the first time in many years, Manuel prayed. He didn't ask for anything, he only gave thanks. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I'm ready. Whatever it is, here I am." And with that certainty, he slept peacefully, accompanied by a faith that no longer needed explanation. The following days were filled with unexpected encounters. In a garage in Monclova, while repairing a faulty truck brake, Manuel met a mechanic named Hector. He was a robust man, of few words, but with skillful hands and a gaze that betrayed more history than he told. Seeing the cross hanging in the rearview mirror, Hector asked him, "Are you religious?" Manuel thought for a moment before answering, "I don't know. I only know that I believe in what isn't always seen." Hector nodded, as if he understood perfectly. At the end of the service, he didn't want to charge him. "For what you gave me today, this is priceless," he said. Manuel didn't fully understand, but he smiled. He was beginning to accept that sometimes one sows seeds without knowing it. That faith isn't always preached, it's contagious, and that, as Jesus taught him, simple gestures have a power that words can never reach. On one of his longer routes between Monterrey and Ciudad Victoria, Manuel began to feel the weight of loneliness again. Although something in him had awakened, there were still grey days, long silences, and painful memories. But now he knew what to do with it. He didn't ignore it or avoid it. He looked it in the face. At a gas station, he saw a woman sitting alone, clutching a backpack. Her face was red from the sun, and her eyes were swollen. Manuel offered her a glass of water. She accepted it without saying anything. After a while, they began talking. Her name was Teresa, and she had fled a violent relationship. She wasn't asking for help. She just needed to breathe. Manuel listened. He didn't offer solutions, but he accompanied her to the next city, making sure she arrived safely. As they said goodbye, she said, "Thank you for reminding me that there are still good people." And Manuel knew he had done the right thing. On another occasion, while driving along a secondary route near Ciudad Mante, he encountered a religious procession partially blocking the road. It was a group of peasants with images, lit candles, and soft chanting. Manuel slowed down, unbothered, and silently watched as they passed. One of the children walking in front looked up and greeted him enthusiastically. Manuel returned the gesture, and something in that childlike gaze brought back memories of his own childhood, when he would go with his mother on village pilgrimages. He remembered her singing voice, the simple faith with which she lived, and for an instant he felt she was there, accompanying him. That fleeting moment was enough for a tear to roll down his cheek. Jesus was right. Sometimes you just need to be willing to feel again. One day, while waiting for the truck to be unloaded at a warehouse in Tampico, he found an old newspaper in the break room. On the front page was a photo of a man in a light-colored tunic walking among migrants. The headline read, "The Stranger Who Comforts Without Speaking." The article recounted stories similar to those Manuel had experienced in different places with similar testimonies. He froze. The man's name wasn't mentioned. No one knew who he was or where he came from. They only spoke of his calm, his gaze, his demeanor. Manuel felt a chill. It wasn't just him. Others had also seen, felt, and heard him without words. He put the newspaper in his backpack and spent the rest of the day in silence, absorbing what he had just read. It was as if Jesus was still walking in more places with more people, and although he no longer traveled by his side, his presence multiplied in every story. Manuel began collecting those clippings. Every time he heard a rumor about someone who healed with just a glance or who helped without asking anything in return, he looked in newspapers, at stations, in conversations with other truck drivers. He didn't do it out of obsession, but out of a mixture of certainty and hope. It was like following the trail of something that didn't need proof, but that the heart appreciated confirming. At a small terminal in Ciudad del Carmen, a colleague told him about a man who appeared in the middle of a storm to help evacuate a town and then disappeared without a trace. It was strange, as if the rain didn't affect him, he said. Manuel said nothing, but that night, as he wrote in his notebook, he noted, "He doesn't walk alone, he walks with us." Because something inside him told him that Jesus hadn't left. He had simply dissolved into the goodness of those who dare to act. One dawn, as he crossed the mountains toward Veracruz, a heavy rainstorm forced him to stop at an empty rest stop. The sound of the water on the cars. Body was hypnotic, and Manuel remained silent for a long time, staring at the cross in his rearview mirror. He thought of his brother Luis, of the absurd argument before the accident, of all the times he wanted to call him and didn't. He closed his eyes, and in the midst of that storm he said aloud, "I miss you, brother. Forgive me." There was no supernatural response. Jesus didn't appear, nor did the heavens open, but something inside him was released, as if he could finally breathe without that constant weight. And then he understood the true miracle wasn't that Jesus had accompanied him on the road, but that he had accompanied him inward. He had guided him back to himself, and that was worth more than any sign. Days later, in a convenience store on the outskirts of Poza Rica, a boy approached timidly as Manuel was paying for a coffee. "Are you the man in the white truck with the cross?" he asked. Manuel bent down and answered yes. The boy took a folded sheet of paper out of his pocket and handed it to him. It was a child's drawing, a trailer with wings, and on the windshield, a luminous figure. "My grandma says you help people like angels," the boy explained before running off. Manuel stood still, moved. He didn't know how the boy had recognized him, or if it was just a coincidence, but when he looked at that drawing, he felt something akin to the purest love, the love of being seen unconditionally, without merit, only for what one conveys. He put the sheet of paper in the notebook where he wrote his stories, and thought that perhaps, without knowing it, he was leaving a mark similar to Jesus's. On another route to Puebla, in the middle of a busy day with little rest, Manuel picked up an elderly woman hitchhiking with a bag full of vegetables. She thanked him with a sweet smile and told him she was going to visit her sick sister. During the ride, she softly sang old songs, the kind almost no one remembers. Manuel listened to her like someone listening to their own grandmother from the past. As they dropped her off at her destination, the woman took her hand tightly and said, "God always sends someone just when we need them most." Manuel didn't respond. He just nodded and got back behind the wheel, moved. It was no longer a coincidence, no longer isolated gestures. Everything was part of an invisible web that linked stories, people, and moments. A web woven with compassion, with listening, with presence, just as Jesus had taught him. And that, he realized, never ends. One cloudy afternoon, while driving through the industrial zone of Tlaxcala, Manuel found a stray dog lying in the middle of the road. He braked to avoid hitting it and got out to carefully move it. The animal, old and thin, could barely walk. Without thinking twice, he lifted it into the cab and settled it in a corner with a blanket. He took it with him to the next stop, where he bought some food and water. He decided to name it Feel. From that day on, Feel accompanied him on many routes, lying peacefully in the cab, as if he had always been there. People began to recognize them together, the truck driver with the calm expression and the silent dog. And although Manuel knew that not every day could be filled with miracles, he felt that even a gesture as simple as caring for a dog was a way to continue the legacy he had received, because caring is also loving. In Veracruz, he met a young nurse at a gas station, exhausted after a 36-hour shift. She sat next to him at a plastic table, both eating in silence. After a while, they began to talk. She told him she doubted her vocation, that she had lost many patients, and that she no longer knew if it was worth continuing. Manuel had no answers, but he shared his story. He didn't talk about Jesus directly, but he did talk about the journey, about how learning to stop had changed his life. She listened to him with glassy eyes. As he said goodbye, she said, "Thank you. I didn't know I needed to hear you." And Manuel understood once again that his mission wasn't to preach or convince. It was to be there, to accompany, to inspire without imposing. And with each shared story, a new spark was lit in someone. Perhaps that was what Jesus wanted from the beginning, to ignite hearts, one by one. One early morning, on an empty road toward Oaxaca, Manuel stopped at a wayside chapel. He had never been devoted to saints or virgins, but something called him to enter. The place was empty, with unlit candles and worn wooden benches. He sat in the semi-darkness, his hands on his knees, and asked for nothing. He just breathed. He closed his eyes, and in his mind, he saw Jesus again getting into his truck, accompanied by those 12 silent and wise men. He remembered that first glance, the phrase, "Wherever you are going, if you are willing to take us." And he understood that this was not a physical destination, but an internal journey. Jesus had used the outer path to teach him how to navigate the inner path. And that night, in that forgotten chapel, Manuel said softly, "I am still willing." He didn't know what exactly, but he felt there was still more to give, to learn. After that moment, he began visiting places he'd previously ignored, orphanages, nursing homes, remote communities. He didn't do it out of charity, but out of presence. He sat to play with children, to talk with the elderly, to listen to stories from people living on the margins. He didn't bring large donations or speeches, just time, just listening. And in those encounters he found Jesus again and again, in the laughter of a child who hugged him without knowing him, in the tears of a grandmother who sang him a forgotten song, in the grateful gaze of a man who only needed to be seen. He began to understand that the sacred isn't in the spectacular, but in the everyday, in stopping, in looking, in giving, without expecting. And every time he returned to his truck, he felt his heart grow a little wider, as if it no longer belonged only to him, but also to all those he touched along the way. At a rural fair in Chiapas, while delivering an order for a local cooperative, a group of children approached, curious to see Phil leaning out the truck window. Manuel got out, sat on the side of the vehicle, and began to chat with them. He asked them their names, their dreams, what they wanted to be when they grew up. One said teacher, another doctor, another simply travel like you. Manuel smiled. He took some notebooks and pencils out of his backpack, which he had started carrying to give away without any organization behind it, just on impulse. He gave them to each one. The emotion on the children's faces overwhelmed him. As he climbed back into the truck, Phil laid his head on his lap and looked at him as if he knew what he was doing. Manuel stroked his back and thought, maybe this is how love multiplies, in small acts that spread without a sound. One day, passing by an old ruined station, Manuel decided to stop for no apparent reason. He walked through the rubble, and among stones and rotten wood, he found an intact bench. He sat down, gazing at the horizon. In that dense silence, a question welled up from deep within him. What if I too were chosen? Not as a prophet, nor as an enlightened one, but as someone who must live to awaken something in others. He understood that it wasn't necessary to have been special to carry out a mission, that sometimes the only condition is being willing. He remembered Jesus' phrase on the board, "Where there is a willing heart, there I will be." And he understood that it wasn't an external promise, but an internal guide. Jesus hadn't disappeared. He lived in every choice Manuel made with an open heart, and that was enough. With that, his life would never again be a simple routine of kilometers. Sometime later, in a chance encounter at a Guadalajara bus station, Manuel met a young woman who claimed to be writing a book about unexplained stories from the road. She had heard about him from other drivers and asked him to share his experience. At first, he hesitated. He didn't want his story to become a spectacle, but seeing the sincerity in the girl's eyes, he agreed. He told her about Jesus, the group, the journey, how everything changed with a simple decision to stop. She didn't take notes. She just listened to him in silence. Finally, she said, "Thank you. I don't know if I believe in miracles, but I do believe in what you're telling me." And that was enough for Manuel, because he understood that his testimony wasn't meant to convince, but to sow seeds. And if someone, even just one person, was encouraged to look differently thanks to him, then it was worth it. On another trip, this time in Aguascalientes, he ran into a young mother with 2 young children waiting at a bus station without money or a ticket. He approached her and cautiously asked if he could help. She didn't ask for anything but accepted. With a mixture of relief and embarrassment, Manuel bought the bus tickets and left them some food. As he left, one of the children said to him, "You look like one of those good men in the movies." Manuel smiled, and as he returned to the bus, he thought that maybe that's what life was. A movie where we could all be characters who changed the course of another. Not with great feats, but with simple acts. In every decision to look at others, to stop, to be. Because he had learned that miracles don't happen to be admired, but to inspire. And every time he chose to act from the heart, the miracle was repeated. One morning, while he was having breakfast at a roadside restaurant near Celaya, a group of university students doing fieldwork sat near him. One of them saw the cross hanging around his neck and asked if he was a believer. Manuel took his time before answering. "I believe in people, in gestures, in the silence that embraces, and in a man who showed me all of this without saying." Who he was, the young people, intrigued, asked him to tell more, and for the first time he told the whole story from the beginning, omitting nothing. When he finished, the group was silent. One of them, with tears in his eyes, said, "They teach us many things at the university, but this is what I want to remember." Manuel didn't respond. He simply expressed his gratitude, because he understood that sometimes it wasn't necessary to convince with arguments. It was enough to share what you've experienced and let everyone take away what they need. Over time, Manuel began receiving letters. He didn't know how or why, but at different bus stops and terminals, envelopes with his name handwritten on them awaited him. Some were from people he had helped, others from strangers who had heard his story. In all of them, the message was the same: "Thank you for stopping." And those words, repeated in different strokes, became a permanent echo in his soul. He kept each letter in a metal box inside his truck, as if they were relics. Sometimes, in moments of tiredness or doubt, he reread them, and in each one, he found a spark that drove him on. He no longer needed signs from heaven or mysterious apparitions. He knew he was on the right path, because the touched hearts confirmed it, and he understood with humility that the true miracle hadn't been Jesus getting into his truck, but him daring to open the door. One day, while waiting in a long line to cross a toll booth on the outskirts of Hermosillo, he looked again at the truck's dashboard. The cross was still there, hanging next to his mother's rosary. But now there were also photos, children's drawings, holy cards, and phrases written on folded papers. His cab had become a small mobile shrine, not for religion but for memory. It was a testament to everything he had sown and everything he had reaped. Each object had a story, a name, an emotion. And as he looked into that space, Manuel realized his life was no longer empty. He was accompanied by hundreds of invisible presences, those he had helped, those who helped him, those who listened to him, those who simply crossed his path. And deep down, Jesus, the first one who dared to look at him as no one had before. At a transportation fair in Monterrey, where new truck models and technological advances were being exhibited, Manuel was invited by a company that admired his career. He never imagined his story would spread so widely. He was received with respect. Some greeted him with affection, others with curiosity. A journalist approached him and asked, "Do you think all this started just because you picked up some men on the highway?" Manuel looked at him calmly and said, "It didn't start there. It started the day I decided to stop." The journalist remained silent, as if he didn't know what else to ask. Because Manuel knew something few understood. Great changes don't come with announcements. They come as a choice. And stopping that day, against all impulse, was the beginning of his new life. People applauded him as an example, but he still felt the same. An ordinary man, guided by an extraordinary experience. An experience that, rather than changing him, revealed him. A few months later, he received an unreturned letter that shook him. It said, "Thank you for taking care of my son that day. Jesus came home talking about you as if you were a hero. I don't know what he said, but since then he's no longer afraid of public speaking. Now he dreams of being a driver like you." Manuel didn't remember exactly which child he was referring to, but he understood that it didn't matter. Every seed planted blossomed in its own time, and sometimes without one noticing. That letter made him cry in the middle of a gas station, not from sadness, but from fulfillment, because it proved once again that you never know the reach of a simple gesture. Sometimes a look, a word, or a smile can open new paths for someone else. And that for him was the true purpose, not to live for oneself, but to live to touch others, as they did for him. One night in San Cristobal de las Casas, while he was staying in a small driver's hostel, an elderly man approached him in the shared kitchen. He wore a worn cap and had a tired voice. He asked if he was the famous Manuel of the Cross. Upon receiving confirmation, the man stared at him for a long time and said, "I saw that man too, but no one believed me." They sat and talked until night turned into dawn. They shared memories, anecdotes, and silences. And finally, the old man said, "Maybe we weren't chosen. Maybe we just realized that he is everywhere." Manuel didn't respond. He just reached out and shook it tightly. Because at that moment, he didn't need explanations, theories, or certainties. He only needed to know that he wasn't alone, that others had also felt the same way, and that, deep down, they were all walking the same invisible path. At another stop near Durango, a young man who worked as a gas station attendant recognized him and approached him timidly. He told him he'd seen a video on social media that told his story, and that since then he'd changed his way of treating people. "I used to be an ogre to everyone. Now I try to be more like you." Manuel smiled humbly. He explained that he wasn't a saint or a wise man, just a man who was once afraid and decided to trust. The young man offered him a coffee, and they sat down to chat for a few minutes. As they said goodbye, the young man said, "Thank you for not forgetting the common people." And Manuel understood that his story wasn't just a memory, it was a living tool. Every person who listened to him and decided to act with more humanity was part of that legacy. A legacy that wasn't his own, but that of all those who believe it's still worth pausing. On a grueling day along the dusty roads of Zacatecas, Manuel thought about what he would do if one day he could no longer drive. His age was beginning to show. His hands were no longer as steady. His back ached more often. But instead of fretting, he considered another possibility, sharing what he had experienced, teaching newcomers, not from a lecture, but from experience. He imagined sitting in some rural school, telling stories of the road to wide-eyed children or accompanying young drivers on their first trips, teaching them that driving is also about looking, listening, and feeling. Maybe he wouldn't have the same strength he had before, but he would have more clarity. And that, he thought, was also a way to keep going, because the journey doesn't end when the engine is turned off. It ends when you stop sharing what you've learned. And he still had a lot to give. One clear night at a high point in the desert, Manuel stopped the truck to rest. He lay down on the bunk bed, the door open, feel lying at his feet. The sky was clear, dotted with stars, and the silence was so profound that he could hear his own heartbeat. He took the cross out of the rearview mirror and held it against his chest. He closed his eyes and returned to that initial moment when he saw that man in the light-colored robes at the side of the road. He remembered the doubt, the fear, and the decision, and he knew with absolute certainty that everything he experienced afterward was the fruit of that openness. Not a supernatural sign, but a human act, stopping, opening the door, trusting. He didn't need to know more. He didn't need proof, because his life was now the testimony. And amid the silence of that night, Manuel whispered, "Thank you for not passing by that day. Thank you for coming." In the following months, Manuel slowed down his work pace, not because he was losing strength, but because he wanted each route to have meaning. He selected his routes, his deliveries, and took the opportunity to visit those he had met along the way. The nurse in Veracruz, the elderly man in San Cristobal, the mechanic in Monclova. He carried a notebook where he jotted down thoughts, reflections, and phrases that others had given him. He also added children's drawings, anonymous blessings, and short stories that people told him in whispers. He decided to call this notebook Kilometers of the Soul. He didn't plan to publish it or make it famous. He just wanted to leave something that could be kept in the hands of someone who needed it. One day, perhaps, someone would open those pages in the midst of a crisis and find a phrase, a story, a memory that would help them carry on. And that would be his last act of companionship, to be there even when he was gone. One afternoon in Querétaro, his hometown, Manuel stopped in front of the house where he'd grown up. No one lived there anymore. The walls were peeling and the yard was overgrown with weeds. He got out of the truck and walked slowly to the rusty gate. He placed his hands on the cold metal and closed his eyes. He listened to his mother's laughter, his brother's footsteps, the cries of children playing in the street. Everything was still vivid in his memory. He didn't go in. He didn't need to. That place was no longer a home. It was a symbol, a root, a part of his history that now he could look at without pain. Upon returning to the truck, he placed a dried flower on the dashboard, not as a tribute, but as a reminder of how far he'd come from that boy who once dreamed of driving his own trailer, and how, in the end, he'd found much more than roads. He'd found meaning. During a routine medical checkup, the doctor asked him if he had any family. Manuel hesitated before answering. He thought of his mother, who had already passed away, of his brother, of those he met along the way, of Phil, of the children, of the letters he had received, and he replied, "Yes, I have an extended family. They don't live with me, but they are within me." The doctor smiled, not fully understanding, but Manuel knew he wasn't lying. He no longer needed to conform to a mold to feel accompanied. He had forged true bonds, invisible but firm, with people he would never have imagined meeting. And in each of those bonds, he carried a part of Jesus, because that was the real miracle. Not that he had chosen him, but that he had taught him to see. And now, with every gesture, with every stop, with every attentive listening, Manuel multiplied what he received, without fanfare, without applause, only with the same serenity of the man who once waited for him by the side of the road. Over time, some called it a legend, others an exaggeration. They said no truck driver could have experienced all that they were just people's inventions, stories distorted by emotion. Manuel never defended himself. He didn't seek to convince anyone. He knew what he had experienced, what he had felt, and that was enough. In a radio interview, he was asked if he still hoped to see Jesus again. He remained silent for a few seconds, then replied, "I see him every day. In every person who dares to stop for another, in every gesture that comes without expecting anything. And when I look in the mirror, sometimes I see him there too." The host didn't know what to say. She only expressed her gratitude. Because even without intending to, Manuel continued to touch hearts, not from the spotlight, but from the humility of one who recognizes that the greatest things aren't shouted out. They are lived, they are transmitted, and they leave a mark. One morning, he passed through the same stretch of El Huizache again. The sky was clear, and the heat was just as hot as that time. When he reached the curve, he instinctively braked. He looked to the side of the road, as if expecting to see them again. No one was there, only earth, sun, and a thick silence. But his heart was beating strongly, as if recognizing something invisible. He got out, walked a few meters, and stood still. He closed his eyes. He felt the wind brush his face, heard the crunch of the dry grass. And then he knew this was the place where it all began. He smiled, not because he expected a new miracle, but because he had realized he was already experiencing it. The true miracle had been allowing that encounter to transform him. And now, at that very spot, He felt complete, not because he had all the answers, but because he no longer needed them. Back in the truck, Manuel opened the glove compartment and took out the heart-shaped stone. He held it in his palm, staring at it for a long time. He remembered Jesus' words, "When you doubt yourself, remember that you have been loved." For years he had carried guilt, silence, nameless wounds, but now he understood that love is not measured by perfection, but by presence. There was more comfort in that small rock than 1,000 sermons. He put it back, not out of attachment, but out of gratitude, because every object he had received on that trip was more than a memory. It was a compass. And although he no longer needed signs, he liked to have those fragments of the journey, like someone who saves breadcrumbs so as not to get completely lost in the forest of life. As he started the engine, he said quietly, "Let's go, Esperanza." And the truck started off smoothly, as if it too understood that something had changed. He no longer drove for goals or commitments or out of habit. He drove by choice, because every kilometer was a new opportunity to share what he had learned, to touch a life, to hear a story. He passed through towns, stations, curves, and at each place he paused a little longer. He was no longer in a hurry, because he understood that the important thing wasn't arriving, but what happened along the way. Sometimes he got out of the truck just to look at the horizon, other times to listen to a stranger. And in those simple moments he found the divine, as if Jesus was still there sitting beside him, silent, smiling. At a small station in Chiapas, a young man asked to take a photo with him. He said his father often spoke to him about the truck driver who picked up Jesus. Manuel agreed, a little uncomfortable with the attention, but smiled sincerely. Then the young man asked him, "And what did you feel when you saw him for the first time?" Manuel was silent for a moment and then said, "I felt like the world stopped, as if I'd been given a second chance without asking for it." The young man guarded that phrase carefully, as if he'd been given a secret, and Manuel understood that. Perhaps that was what had happened from the beginning. It wasn't an extraordinary story to tell, but an experience to share, not out of greatness, but out of truth, out of humanity. Because sometimes the most powerful things happen in the moments no one expects, in the simple decisions that change everything. Over the years, Phil grew old, and one day he didn't wake up. Manuel buried him in a clearing by the road under a shady tree. He placed a small cross with his name on it and stayed there. For a long time, he didn't cry in despair, he simply gave thanks, because that dog had accompanied him through one of the most sacred stages of his life, and he understood once again that everything we love leaves a mark, and that goodbyes, when there is gratitude, don't hurt as much. He returned to the truck alone, but with a full heart, because he had learned not to fear loss, but to celebrate the time they had shared, and that too he had learned from Jesus. Today, if someone asks for Manuel on the roads of Mexico, they might find him, perhaps at a bus station, at a roadside inn, or under a tree listening to someone who needs to talk. He doesn't wear robes, nor does he perform miracles, but wherever he goes, he leaves something behind, a word, a pause, a presence. And if you look closely, you might see him stop at any curve, and in that instant you'll understand that there is no act more transformative than choosing to be. Because one day, on a forgotten curve, Manuel decided to slow down, and that changed everything. You've already done the most important thing: stop and feel. Now, if you want to keep receiving stories like this, subscribe to the channel. It keeps us connected.